the crocodile, they caught it up, taped its mouth shut, which is standard practice, and then turned it loose in the back of the Chevy Suburban that I drove.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is the longtime superintendent of the Dickerson Park Zoo. Mike Crocker, who is called Snake by his friends, and more on that later, is retiring next year after 47 years of caring for over 400 species of animals at the zoo. He is here today to give us a look back on the last 100 years of zoo operations and a look forward into the next century as the zoo builds on its efforts to preserve endangered species from all over the world. Mike, welcome to In Our Town.
Thank you.
Well, I did a teaser there. You're known by your friends as Snake. Tell us how that came about.
I love snakes. I've kept live snakes since I was probably 12 years old. At one time, my collection of live snakes was pretty large. So I got the nickname Snake when I was a kid, and all of my brothers, my family, everybody that we knew, that's what they all called me by. You could call today to the zoo and ask for Snake, and the receptionist would know exactly who you're talking to. So that's kind of where that came from.
I've read in preparation for the interview some stories regarding your interactions with snakes. You're not reluctant to handle one, even if it's poisonous.
No, I'm not.
Have you been bitten by a poison one?
I have never been bitten by a venomous snake. I've come close a time or two. During my 47 years at the zoo, we've had 2 people bitten by venomous snakes. We had an employee bitten in 1978 by a western diamondback rattlesnake. So I recall she spent about 3 days in the hospital. In the early 80s, a man who was a reptile keeper at the time and my mentor in the world of reptiles when I was growing up was bitten by a timber rattlesnake, and he spent overnight in the hospital and was released.
Are you just that careful or lucky?
Maybe some of both. I try to be careful.
I was reading about when you were a kid, you'd like to go down by Chadwick and go after those rattlesnakes.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember years ago, there used to be a little church down there, and once a year they would go out and capture those things?
Pine Ridge Church, and it's still there.
They still do it?
They don't do that anymore. It got started when I was in high school. They would have revivals at the church, and they would see a lot of copperheads and maybe an occasional rattlesnake around, and somehow or other they built on that and established a snake roundup that they'd have every year. And in the early years of the snake roundup, they would kill them all.
Uh-huh.
They would go catch them for weeks or more at a time and save them up until the official time of the snake roundup, bring them in and throw them in the bonfire and things like that. And then eventually they had a guy that was buying them from them, which was illegal according to the wildlife code in Missouri. And that's what got it shut down, was the wildlife code.
Well, I've heard of snake handlers like in Tennessee and stuff. Were they kind of the same philosophical or religious bent, or was it something else motivating them?
No. Well, I don't know that the one in Chadwick really had the religious connotation so much. Now, the one in Kentucky and Tennessee and all, those people drink strychnine and they freely handle timber rattlesnakes and cottonmouths and copperheads, and they get bit fairly often. And they sometimes die from those snake bites. And some of the leaders of those cults even will die from those snake bites.
I was in Taipei, Taiwan, like 40 years ago, and there's a place there called Snake Alley. And you see all kinds of crazy things there. It's like a narrow road with garage doors on both sides of it that open up into little shops. And you would see a cobra right out here on a stand. I assume that they'd taken the poison out of it, but he'd be alive. And then in another area, I don't know what kind of snake it was, but they had like these 8 or 9 foot long snakes, and they had them tied up to a rope in the ceiling. And these snakes were alive. And then these guys would take a knife and slice the snake all the way down the belly and catch the blood and drink it, because they thought that that created, I don't know, some kind of strength or something. You ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Pretty well known.
is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you're much nicer to your snake friends.
No, I would never do that.
But my gosh, I was a young man seeing that. That was pretty crazy. Well, so when did you start at the zoo?
July of 1976. I was hired to be the zoo's reptile keeper. I have a college degree in wildlife management and conservation, but I was really hired more for my personal experience with reptiles at the time. By then, I'd been keeping a big variety of live snakes and other types of reptiles for about 15 years.
Just as a hobbyist?
Yes. So that's really how I got started in the zoo business.
And what did the reptile exhibit consist of in those days?
Well, it wasn't real extensive. The Sweeney Hall, the old building that was believed to have been built in 1875, the public referred to it as the Snake House. It housed some small animal exhibits. At that time, when I started, it was all reptile exhibits. The zoo director and his family lived in the lower floor of the building opposite those exhibits. The administrative offices were upstairs in the building. So I don't remember how many exhibits that we had at the time. If I had to guess, 20 to 30, maybe in that range. So that's what I took care of, was those animals.
Or were they just lizards and turtles and snakes?
There were a little bit of everything. The larger exhibit had some caiman in it, which is the Central and South American relative of the American alligator.
Uh-huh.
And they're much smaller. They were probably 3 or 4 feet long. A variety of snakes, a few lizards that I recall, some Bengal monitors and that sort of thing.
It must have been quite a production to feed all those animals. I mean, a lot of them want to eat like live rats and that sort of thing, right?
Most of the stuff was fed dead rodents. Snakes generally will readily eat dead rodents. We would buy rats and mice, and depending on what it was, we had a big python at the time, and it was fed dead rabbits. So, they're humanely killed. They're not grabbed and suffocated by the snake, and it's more humane to do it that way. It's also safer for the snake. Things like rats are notorious for chewing snakes up. Why the snakes tolerate it, I don't know, but they can actually kill a snake.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, sometimes they'll chew on rattlesnakes and stuff, and for whatever reason, the snakes may get to where they're almost afraid of a live one in the cage with them sometimes. But we don't feed much in the way of live stuff at all.
So in those days, back in 76, when you started, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what the zoo was like?
Well, it was pretty primitive at that time. It was really an eyesore. If you looked out across to the west, across much of the zoo, all you saw were rows and rows of chain link fences that defined the hoofed animal exhibits, or whether that be camels or antelopes of some sort or bison. But there were so many lines of those to the human eye, it was kind of an eyesore. It didn't look very nice. Our commissary operation, which was in the basement of the old lion house, consisted of a wood chopping block, I'll call it, where we cut up the meat diets for the cats and stuff. It really wasn't very sanitary. It wasn't modern. So a lot of the early years of the zoo was building up to modern standards, and which we are now. The old zoo is long gone. That's how it was when I started.
I've always thought it's unusual for a town the size of Springfield even have a zoo.
It is. Most cities the size of Springfield don't have zoos. We have quite a bit of zoo for the size of community we have to support it.
How did it get started in the first place?
Well, it began as a privately owned zoo in 1890. It only lasted a few years. What little information we have on that original zoo indicated it was pretty large by the standards of that time. But it closed, I think, around 1893 or 4. And then the city bought the property from the estate of Jerome Dickerson in 1922. So they had a small zoo located in Phelps Grove Park at that time. In fact, you can go walk through Phelps Grove now, and if you know what you're looking for, you can see the remains of the old concrete foundations from the structures from back then.
Oh, no kidding. I didn't know that.
So they moved those animals to the new location where we are now in 1923.
I'll be. So then in 1923, it was purchased by the city?
Yeah, it was part of the Parks Department. There was a stipulation in the sale that the area always be known as Dickerson Park. And we have a park in front of the zoo, and we are the zoo within Dickerson Park.
I guess it became part of the Parks Department. Is that how it worked?
I became director in 1988.
Oh, I see. How long did you work at the zoo before you became director?
12 years.
The zoo is just a totally different place today than what it was in those days. Tell us a little bit about what forces were at work to make it change course like it did.
The zoo really had been neglected for decades. It had gotten so bad by 1975 that they were getting so many complaints from the public about the poor conditions at the zoo. I mean, they even had domestic dogs on exhibit.
Oh, no kidding.
Eagles and things like that. The park board voted on whether or not they wanted to keep the zoo open. But by a very narrow margin, they decided to keep the zoo open and try to start putting more money into it. So,
well, it was a money loser at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Zoo Society, which originally started as the Greater Ozarks Zoological Society, formed in 1970. They renamed themselves to Friends of the Zoo in the 80s. But in the early years, they were responsible for all of capital improvements. It wasn't until probably mid to late 80s that the city started to put some money into capital improvements.
As I recall, I'm sure there were other people that were very actively involved in the zoo from a philanthropic standpoint, but one name that sticks out in my mind was Mellor's Photo Labs.
Yes, Jim and Marietta Mellor donated a lot of money to the zoo. Oh, I'm going to say that was from around the mid-70s to probably the early to mid-80s. They donated $100,000, best I remember, to the Blackberry exhibit. At one time, they donated, I think it was $50-some thousand to buy animals for the zoo. So they were one of our early supporters that helped kind of move things along. Another one that really was instrumental in the turnaround at the zoo was the Community Foundation of the Ozarks.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The very first grant that they made after they formed was for a petting zoo.
That's right. Jan Horton would have been the director at the Community Foundation in those days.
They just celebrated their 50th anniversary a few weeks ago. So progress was slow at first, but as time went on, just got better and got better. We had the new lion exhibit about 1982 or 83. And we built what was originally the elephant and giraffe building, named after the Mellors. And that was around 1978 or 79. Elephants have since been moved to new facilities in the northern part of the zoo, and it's just pretty much giraffes now. But that was early major improvements at the zoo.
How has zoo management changed over the years?
The zoo business as a whole has become more technical, more scientific in operation. If you look at how animals are managed, most of the animals we have in the zoo now are managed at a national level for genetic diversity. So you have a committee for each species that does calculations on their genetics, and they determine pairings for breeding. So the result is that we have animals coming and going all the time, specific males and females being paired up for genetic diversity. So it's become a lot more professionally oriented, a lot more complex in operation than what it was when I started 47 years ago.
You've always, of course, welcomed people to come and to view the animals, but rather than just being a tourist attraction, it's developed sort of what I might call a mission to save species. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that is our core mission. In fact, as an accredited institution member of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, our core mission is saving species. So by people coming to the zoo and having a pleasant family outing or a school group coming to the zoo as part of what they do, especially in the spring, the money that we generate from those operations is what makes it possible for us to support wildlife conservation programs around the world.
So on that particular point, are you gaining or losing, do you think, in terms of preventing wildlife extinction of species?
No, there's been a lot of good accomplishments in that area. We currently support 20 some odd different programs ourselves. and we're always trying to increase the amount of money that we're able to contribute to that. We currently spend in the range of $50,000 to $70,000 or so a year supporting those different programs. And just to give you an example, the Cheetah Conservation Fund, which is based in Namibia in southwestern Africa, it's one of the programs that we support. We've been really good at, very successful in breeding cheetahs at our zoo, which is a noteworthy accomplishment, actually. But they've actually been able to successfully reintroduce cheetahs back to the wild and raise orphan cheetahs, teach them how to hunt, that sort of thing. Nobody thought that could be very easily done, big carnivores and turning them back into the wild. But at least with cheetahs, they've been able to do that. There are species now in the wild that wouldn't be there if it weren't for what zoos were able to do over the last few decades.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Jeff Kessinger. I'm the Reader Engagement Editor for the Springfield Daily Citizen. A day in the life of the Reader Engagement Editor starts around 8 a.m., getting the newsletters, SGF AM, all ready to go, making sure the forecast is up to date for you, and gathering links from other news organizations. After that, I spend a few hours on social media. I have to schedule our posts, have to check the comments and make sure everybody's behaving nicely. In the afternoon, I usually turn my attention to editing some of our freelance contributors, and I also do some reporting of my own on arts and culture happenings. Springfield has a great arts community, musicians, visual artists, performance artists. It's important that we give back to the arts community and thank them for the color that they add to our community and to our world. And so by reporting on events that are happening or coming up, I'm helping people find ways to connect with the artists around here.
This is maybe a slight departure from what you're doing presently, but I want to ask you if this is on the planning board. I was just reading something the other day that scientists are getting close to being able to bring woolly mammoths out of extinction because they find their carcasses in the Arctic and the DNA is in reasonably good shape. And I guess with a little gene splicing and that sort of thing, that's something that might happen. Does people in your profession think that's a good idea, or?
I haven't really heard anybody say anything along the lines of ethics, but I did talk to a scientist the other day that just happened to stop by, and he kind of mentioned some of the efforts that are going on and thought some of that, maybe not a pure mammoth, but
a mammoth hybrid
with an Asian elephant, possible within the next 10 years, perhaps. And so he mentioned one or two other species that were being worked on, things along those same lines. So,
well, I guess my larger point is there are some species that have become extinct, but if you still have their DNA, maybe someday you can bring those back. Or is that just science fiction?
No, I don't think so. I think, there are maybe some possibilities. It may not be exactly what originally was around, but something close, perhaps.
What about here in Missouri? What species can you think of that have gone extinct?
I don't know if I can think of anything in Missouri that has gone extinct. There are a few species nationwide that perhaps have, I can't think of anything in modern times.
Yeah.
I mean, we had things like the American lion and the short-faced bear, but they went extinct back about 10 to 12,000 years ago. The woolly mammoth, the mammoth, mastodon, they were all in North America, some of them in Missouri. There are fossil records at the River Bluff Cave on the south side of Springfield. I've seen them.
Right.
Where the short-faced bears scratched on the wall, about 12 to 13 feet up in the air. Some turtles embedded in the wall of the cave that were extinct forms of turtle that were much bigger than any of the box turtles we have now, but they had that type of shell.
Are there any particular species that the zoo is particularly focused on and specializing in terms of preventing their extinction?
The cheetah is one that we work with a lot. Maned wolves we work with quite a bit. Probably those two more than anything else. Maned wolves are South American. They look like giant red foxes, have that same coloration, but they're much larger than the red foxes, but that's what they look like. So we work with those quite a bit.
What's the most popular exhibits at the zoo?
The most popular one right now is probably still elephant. Now, we don't have hippos anymore, but when we did, that was probably the number one. It was the most popular animal with our staff, the most popular with our guests. And it's been a couple of years since we last had hippos, and we don't have any plans to bring hippos back. I mean, to build an exhibit for hippos to modern standards now would be somewhere in the range of $6 to $10 million. And we don't really have a good place to put a hippo exhibit right now.
You mentioned the dollars. What's your annual budget?
Our total annual budget right now is somewhere around $5.3 million.
Are you able to break even, or do you have to get supplemented from like the Parks Board? How's that going?
Well, the zoo is a division of park, so part of our operating budget comes through the park side, and then the rest of the budget comes through the Friends of the Zoo side. Friends of the Zoo, under a contractual relationship with parks, operates all revenue-producing activities at the zoo.
I see.
So if you break the budgets down and look at the total contribution to the overall budget, the park side represents about 55% of the annual budget, and the Friends of the Zoo side represents about 45%. On the park side, that comes from gate admission fees. It comes from a property tax levy that dates back to the early 1900s, and it comes from two countywide sales taxes for parks. One was passed in 2001 and the other in 2006. On the Friends of the Zoo side, it comes from daily business operations, fundraising events like Ball of the Wild, fees that we charge for education classes and rentals and feeding the giraffe and the train ride, the membership program, which you can think of as like an annual pass, a diversity of sources.
How many people go through the turnstiles there every year?
Well, a good average would be around 200,000.
I've always wondered about, what is it just down the road from you, the exotic animal paradise?
Wild animal safari. That's what they call it now.
That's what they call it now. Yes. You know, that used to be owned, as you know, by Pat Jones.
Sure.
And just promote the heck out of that thing. I always wondered, I'm sure you guys have thought about it, would it make sense to be running a bunch of billboards up and down the freeway like he does?
Well, we can't afford the number of billboards that Pat Jones always had, but we do advertise on billboards.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Do you pull in a lot of tourists? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
I would say not a lot of tourists, and I think Wild Animal Safari is probably more tourist-based. I don't remember offhand what their admission fee is, but it's pretty pricey. So it's a totally different kind of operation.
Yeah.
They're not accredited. We are, so they operate, by completely different standards.
Well, you've just celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the zoo. What's your crystal ball say the next 100 years?
Well, I'd like to see it around. Well, I won't see it around, but I hope it's around for another 100 years. But we have a master plan that kind of lays out our vision for the next perhaps 10 years or so. We don't like to put a timetable on it because everything's dependent on money and that sort of thing, and it's impossible to project when you're going to come up with that funding. But we have room for some expansion. I don't know that we need to have a huge amount of expansion because we've got a pretty good-sized zoo for this community, but
Then how big is the zoo acreage-wise?
we actually own about, between Friends of the Zoo and the City of Springfield Parks, we have about 90 acres.
Okay.
Right now we're using probably roughly somewhere around 56 of that acres.
So you got room to grow.
So we got room to grow. One of our biggest priorities right now is more paved parking areas. Between us and the fairgrounds, there's always a need for more parking space. And then, the things that are probably most likely to happen in terms of new exhibits, assuming the species are available, and that changes all the time, usually for the worse, because as time goes on, fewer and fewer things are available. But Komodo dragons we'd like to have. They'd be very popular. Red pandas would probably be real popular. And one that a lot of our keeper staff would love to have right now is rhinos.
Sounds dangerous to me.
Oh, not as much as elephants.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I want to, before we conclude today, tell our listeners about this book you've written, True Tales from Dickerson Park.
I get asked all the time when I'm at meetings and stuff to tell zoo stories. And so with my retirement coming up last year, I thought, well, I ought to put that down in writing and leave it for people to be able to read, since I'm not going to be around to tell those stories in person. And I did that. I spent a few months racking my brain, coming up with, and I've got lots and lots of interesting stories from 47 years in the zoo, a lot of them way back in time. Got it all put together. My PR marketing director, Joey Powell, edited the material for me several times. So we got to the point where I was with that material. Now, what do we do to put it in a finished form? Didn't know what to do. I thought, if I take this to a printer and have it printed up, it'll cost me a fortune. And I was paying for it myself. And I was willing to spend a little bit of money, but not $10,000 or anything close to that. And we learned something in the process that neither of us knew, that today to publish a book, you don't have to buy a huge quantity of books up front. It doesn't work that way. And that really ended up being our solution that worked really well. We found a local publisher, and that's how we learned all this information, and it worked out really well. And so it's done to a format that's accepted by Amazon and Barnes and Nobles so they can sell it online. So the books are printed on demand. They print books as they're sold. So I ended up only being out about $2,500, which was primarily for the publisher fee.
Oh, is that right?
They had to come up with all the titles for the different sections in the book, the title of the book. I provided a lot of photos for it, any artwork, like on the cover they did. And I never really intended for it to be a book, but that's how it worked out in the end. And it was to my advantage that it did that way because it kept the cost down for me.
Well, that's great. I have to ask you, I'll just mention, not everybody, just old people like you and me have heard about the Cobra scare back in 1953. It was on the front page of Life magazine. You've got some pretty memorable stories there. Why don't you just, before we close, tell us about maybe one or two that come to your mind in your 45 years.
The one that seems like I tell the most often that people really enjoy or they ask about was probably that first year that I worked at the zoo. The former director, Dale Tuttle, decided to send me to Salt Lake City. A former colleague of his ran the venom research lab at the VA hospital in Salt Lake City. So I took off by myself and drove. It's a long ways to get to Salt Lake City. And so when I got there, he took me into some of the room where they had a large number of venomous snakes, everything from rattlesnakes and vipers of various types to king cobras. He pulled out a king cobra onto the floor with his snake hook, just pulled it out of the cage, and it probably reared 3 to 4 feet off the ground. And I had never been that close to a king cobra before, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. So I spent, I think, about 3 days there. It was very interesting, but it got even more interesting on the trip back. I was to bring back some live snake and a 7-foot-long American crocodile. So some of the snakes came from the venom research lab, and some of them came from the Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City. And the crocodile came from the zoo also. So the snakes were put in individual snake bags and then put inside styrofoam boxes to insulate them, because this was late in the year and it was cold out west. The crocodile, they caught it up, taped its mouth shut, which is standard practice, and then turned it loose in the back of the Chevy Suburban that I drove.
Oh, no kidding.
And it immediately shot up over all the seats into the front seat, broke the antenna off my portable radio I took because the Suburban did not have a radio in it. And so caught it up, put it back in the back of the vehicle again. I headed home. And I said, plot out a route for me so I don't have to go through any high mountain passes. Well, I don't think that's even possible. So the route he sent me, I was going through some remote country in southern Utah. It was beautiful country when I was on modern highways, but I would sometimes drive for a couple of hours or longer and never see another vehicle, never see a house, a building of any sort. But I'm seeing beautiful rock bluffs and trees and all kinds of stuff. So by that night, it was getting toward 10 o'clock, and I'm going through Monarch Pass, which is well-known, 13,000 feet, ice and snow everywhere.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm pretty tired by then because I'm by myself. But every time I would stop at a gas station to grab a snack or to gas up, somebody would see the crocodile loose in the back of the Suburban, and they would start hollering at other people to come over and look at it. Well, by about 10:30, I was down on the east side of the Rockies. I'd gone all the way through the pass. I came to a little town, and I believe it was Salida, Colorado. And I thought I'd try to find a motel and get some sleep that night. So I pulled in the parking lot of this one motel, and I pulled up to the door, said no pets on the door. And I looked in through the door, and I could see a little old man in the back watching TV. So I went in and registered. I didn't say anything about the animals I had. So got registered. I backed the vehicle up in front of the door of the room I had, looked around to make sure nobody was looking, and I pulled that crocodile out of there. He probably weighed about 70 pounds or so, and kind of hugged him up to my torso, and he's whipping around, but he can't really bite me or hurt me like that. Got him into the room, and I put him in the bathroom in a shower stall.
Yeah.
That was the only thing I could think to do with him. But for some reason, that bathroom did not have a door on it. So I had to drag the furniture out of the room and pile it in front of the bathroom door to hopefully keep the crocodile in the bathroom during the night. The snakes, I stacked up all these styrofoam boxes. There were probably 3 or 4 boxes next to my bed. So all night long, I could hear these snakes kind of moving around inside their snake bags. You could hear them rub against the styrofoam bottom of the box, making sound. And anytime I would hear another sound, I would think the crocodile was loose in the room, and I'd get up to check on it, but it never moved from the shower stall. So that was an interesting night. I didn't get any sleep. By about 4:30 in the morning, I couldn't take it any longer, and I just gave up. Got up and loaded everything back up, and I drove all the way to the zoo.
That was the zoo business in those days.
That was the zoo business. There's nothing like road trips hauling animals, because anything can happen.
Well, again, the book is True Tales from Dickerson Park Zoo. If somebody's interested in it, where would they pick it up at the zoo or what?
We have them at the gift shop at the zoo. I think ABC Books has them. Not sure about Barnes & Noble, whether they have any in stock right now or not. And they can order them online from Barnes & Noble or Amazon.
Well, Mike, I just want to say I know this has been a labor of love for you for the last 47 years, and the zoo and the animals that live there are much better because of your efforts.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for being today's guest on In Our Town.
You're welcome.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.